I think we're ready to start lecture 5. And this one again is rudimentary title Modern Indian Literature Survey of Some Classic Texts. I should perhaps have said survey of some classic literary texts. Uh, we looked at some nonfiction, and today I have to speak louder. So we'll look at nonfiction. We're going to look at some literary samples today. So we were talking about Derozio, and it's worth listening to just snippets of some of his poems. And I want you to see if you can hear any of the romantic poets that we looked at yesterday, if you can hear them here. To My Native Land, a famous poem. My country! Exclamation mark. In thy days of glory past, a beauteous halo circled round thy brow, and worshipped as a deity thou wast. Where is thy glory? Where the reverence now? Thy eagle pinion is chained down at last, and groveling in the lowly dust art thou. Thy minstrel hath no wreath to weave for thee, save the sad story of thy misery. Well, let me dive into the depths of time and bring from out the ages that have rolled a few small fragments of those wrecks sublime, which human eye may never more behold, and let the guerdon of my labor be, my fallen country, one kind wish for thee. Very much a poem about being under the colonial thumb. It also, if you remember Shelley's, just as an example, Ode to the West Wind, right? Which says, if I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee. Now, in Shelley's case, though, for the Romantics, they were not necessarily addressing a country or their compatriots. They were addressing a kind of spirituality through nature. Most of them were maybe deists. They were not religious in the traditional sense, whereas nor is Derozio necessarily. But Derozio will channel or shift this to the addressing the country, so the thy and the thou are an imagined community, right? Which has not yet been formed totally. So he's writing in English in one part of British India, and it begs the question, which I think Roshinkar Chowdhury will help you answer, and I cannot, which is, who then are the implied readers here, right? Does he imagine that some English sympathizers will read this as well? Certainly he's addressing consciously his fellow Indians. The other thing is, obvious points, the word sublime, as you notice, comes up a lot, right? And so that's very much in the Romantic vein. It's also this idea of a individual expressing his very individual feelings, right? As a modern person, and therefore the exclamation marks, right? Meaning I'm trying to accentuate the feelings that, very much. And I think that is something not brand new, but relatively new at the time. And so we keep that in mind. The other thing is, you can hear more of in the next poem that I assigned, which I know you may not have had time to read, Sonnet to the Pupils of the Hindu College, is very much more, has much more natural imagery. For example, it starts, expanding like the petals of young flowers, I watch the gentle opening of your minds, right? This is less nationalistic on the surface because it's talking about education, about opening the intellect. And he goes on and says, the sweet loosening of the spell that binds your intellectual energies and powers that stretch like young birds in soft summer hours, their wings to try their strength. Oh, how the winds of circumstances and freshening April showers of early knowledge and unnumbered kinds of new perceptions shed their influence. And how you worship truth's omnipotence. Maybe it's fairly self-explanatory, but when I said on the surface it is about the opening of minds, but obviously the coded message is open your minds and see the reality that you're under colonial rule, right? Um, if you put that together with his other poems and writings. So, and to be fair, here's where the complexity of colonialism comes in. He had an English champion, so he had also both in his lifetime and late in the 19th century. There was also E.P. Thompson, a famous Marxist English um, historian, actually Thompson's father, I should say. E.P. Thompson grew up partly in India, but became a famous Marxist historian of England. So I think we have to keep that in mind. The influence of European romantic imagery, which Derozio admired, is clear. He admirably enlists these images to express his pride in India, right? He is not yet confident enough, perhaps, I mean, he's very young, to use the specific floral imagery from the Indian subcontinent, right? He doesn't always do that, right? Now, Toru Dutt, we'd get to in a minute, she does, but maybe he just wasn't quite confident enough. I'm not sure. But his emphasis on education and on intellectual energies is representative of this generation of Indian writers. So that's another reason we read him, is not just his unique poems at a young age, at a formative time in Indian history, literary as well as political, but also he was speaking for that voice. And I think because he died so young, right, as Hausman says, to an athlete dying young, you tend to then aggrandize. I'm not saying unfairly, but it's sort of like, here's someone who was giving his life. It'd be interesting to imagine what would if he had lived through longer, right? See, that's what novelists can do. One of you can write a novel on the older Derozio. I'm not sure he'd be happy if I was, this was part of an exam, but it's interesting to think about. Toru Dutt. I'm sorry, I missed one more thing. Let me just come back. I was reading ahead in my notes. The first poem, and some of this is, I think we're offline, but I'm back. That was magic. So the first poem is more explicitly nationalistic, despite its British motifs and style. Obviously, he similarly repeats a European trope at the time that viewed many regions of the world, including India and China, as once great civilizations that had fallen. So it's not just because they're under colonial rule, but he's kind of imbibed the narrative of the Romantics I mentioned, the Germans and the British and all, that it's the ancient India that we need to cultivate. That was very patronizing, right? Because it said, well, modern Indians don't know enough. We have to show them what they've lost, right? Of course, no one had lost that. It was just they hadn't been expressing it in English, right? So we have to remember, of course, that no Indian writing at this time could openly challenge British rule. So I think perhaps the other thing to give him the benefit of the doubt is that these are restrained calls for past glories. Toru Dutt, as I started with. She's a little later. She also died at 21. But she's maybe a generation later, 1856 to 77. She, along with, and I'm quoting scholars here, along with Derozio, Manmohan Ghosh, Sarojini Naidu, is sort of the inaugurator of Indo-Anglian poetry, right? That branch of writing. That has a big role to play. She published 2 volumes of poetry and a novel in French. So her father took she and her sister to Europe. They studied in both England and in the continent, and she knew fluent French. Her Anglophile father took them to Europe when she was 13 to offer them the best education, right? That's interesting. That shows foresight. Even if it's very Europeanized, it's still remarkable for offering a daughter. The sisters studied in Cambridge and then in parts of the continent, and there was a series they attended called Higher Lectures for Women. That's interesting that they offered something like that, right? Um, there weren't many such offerings, right, at the time. So this poem, um, she's sorry, I should say she's important both for her poetry and as being a rare woman writer at the time. So it's not just that she's writing, has this interesting education, but there aren't many women writers at the time from India or even in Europe, relatively speaking. Uh, our casuarina tree. So here's a poem. Like a huge python winding round and round the rugged trunk, indented deep with scars, up to its very summit near the stars, a creeper climbs, in whose embraces bound no other tree could live. But gallantly the giant wears the scarf, and flowers are hung in crimson clusters, all the boughs among, whereon all days are gathered bird and bee. And oft at nights the garden overflows with one sweet song that seems to have no close, sung darkling from our tree while men repose. Very clearly in the vein of English Romanticism, um, very much filled with. Notice the flowers aren't specified yet, right? In this poem, she's fairly young when she writes this, but interesting image of a giant python. So I won't read the whole poem, but I'll just specify a few notes. There's also the clear influence of Wordsworth I hear here in the terms of memory. It's poignant because she's very young, right? But she's already, from 13, she's not been back to India. And so, understandably, that's really makes her homesick. So she's imagining this in Europe, right? So we have to remember that. She talks about that hoar tree, Hoar, which is the old-fashioned word for. There's a word hoary for frost glinted tree, but there's also the word Hoar. Hoar could just mean older, like an old tree, right? It was already starting to be old fashioned at this time, right, in the 1870s. Is this an intentional archaism? That is to say, an intentional use of old fashioned English? I don't know. But arguably it is. But in any case, the tree becomes the casuarina tree, it becomes that symbol of her longing for home. I think that's the takeaway. She talks about memory, talks about it is the tree's lament and eerie speech that haply to the unknown land may reach. She talks about um, every time the music rose, before mine inner vision rose a form sublime. Thy form, O tree, as in my happy prime I saw thee in my own loved native clime. So here she's addressing a tree. Partly these were safe topics for young women, right? But it's a tree that's in India, right? And so it's not unlike Derosio's address to his country, if that makes sense. So if the tree is a stand-in, an indexical figure for the country. So we have to read these in the context of their times, understanding where and when they were written, as for all literature, right? Remember yesterday we alluded, in a slightly tangential note, but Rob Nixon's point about V.S. Naipaul having a double environmental consciousness, sort of a double, because he's from Trinidad and Tobago, but he wants to be English, and then he goes there. Here we have, it's very different, but that idea of double consciousness, I think, pertains because she, on the one hand, she loves that European, I would say European broadly, ethos and learning, but she misses her Bengal, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. So memory and a lament, a loss. And again, it's very poignant for someone so young, right, to be feeling that. She has one more, and then I'll come to Anandamat. Um, I can't remember exactly when it started, but I hope I'm on the right time. This poem is called Sonnet, the Lotus. Now, here's a more specific reference to an Indian an Indian flower. Love came to Flora, asking for a flower that would of flowers be undisputed queen, the lily and the rose. Long, long had been rivals for that high honor. And she goes on like this, but she says, thus between flower factions, so no, the rose is better, no, the lily. Rang the strife in Psyche's bower. Give me a flower delicious as the rose and stately as the lily in her pride. And of what color? Rose red. Love first chose, then prayed, no, lily white, or both provide. And Flora gave the lotus rose red dyed, D-Y-E-D, and lily white, the queenliest flower that blows. So again, interesting way of balancing the two inspirations, the two sensibilities that she has. So that's Derozio and the poetry, just a taste. Now we come to Anandamat, which is, of course, a famous novel that has been written much about. I rely on the authoritative translation of Julius Lipner, who's from Kolkata originally, at the University of Cambridge or Oxford, I can't remember now. And he published this about 20 years ago, almost. And his introduction is 100 pages long. In other words, the introduction is like a book. It's amazing. I learned a lot, not just about the novel, but about the context in which it was produced, right? And it's interesting to see the debates that we are now familiar with, which is other readers of Anandamat. I mean, they had all kinds of, generally it was well received and so forth, but other Bengalis saying, well, you know, what about it? Was this did you really have they were worried about the actual forest, right? The literal forest, debating whether he had one forest in mind or another, which kind of misses the point, right? So you still have these debates, even today, right? You'll have it all over the world about, does a writer have one thing, specific point in mind? And that is to mistakenly make a direct line between representation and the natural world, right? As if, again, this dream of unmediated depiction. You can't have that. So anyways, the prologue of Anandamat self-evidently lends itself to an eco-critical reading, and the book as a whole is helpful to consider in light of post-colonialism, obviously. So here are the first lines from the prologue in Lipner's translation. A vast forest. Most of the trees in it are sal, specific. But there are many other kinds of tree. The trees with foliage intertwined stretch out in endless ranks, without break or gaps, without even openings for light to penetrate a boundless ocean of leaves. Interesting, ocean, right? So there's that metaphor. Wave upon wave ruffled by the wind rolls on for mile after mile. Below, profound darkness prevails. Even at high noon, the light is dim, dreadful. Humans never venture into that forest. And except for the ceaseless murmur of the leaves and the cries of its wild beasts and birds, no other sound is heard in it. Sounds like a grim place, right? And that's his intent, to paint this initially. Not only is this a vast, profoundly dark forest, but it is also late at night. And it is an extremely dark night, dark even outside the forest. Nothing is visible. And the mass of gloom within it like the darkness in the very bowels of the earth. The birds and animals are completely silent. How many countless millions of animals, birds, worms, and insects live in that forest? Yet not one makes the slightest sound. Indeed, the darkness of which we speak could be imagined, but that brooding silence of an otherwise clamorous world is beyond conceiving. In that boundless forest, then, in that impenetrably dark night, in the inconceivable silence, a voice was heard. Remember that idea of the voice I mentioned in the forest? It's kind of disembodied voice. Will my heart's desire never be fulfilled? And the voice heard once more that mighty forest was plunged in silence. What I find fascinating is, again, you have the combination of a kind of mythic or mystical or religious, whatever term you want to use, forest, because in some ways that invokes the tropes of even for example, fairy tale forests, right? In the dark of the night, right? At the same time, though, he mentions sal, right? Specific trees. And then, as we know, as we go on, this is just the prologue, because as we go on, we know that then he's going to use a very literal historical event, the famine of the late 1700s, 1770s, to in which to set this novel. So I think what we have here, and I'm relying on scholars, of course, but I also read it this way, is we have a very challenging. It's very tough to do this, very difficult, which is that he wants to give a mythic, epic feel to a story that is also very particularized, very historicized. Does that make sense? So it's an actual event, but on the other hand, he wants to make it a national epic. If that makes sense. Now, remember we talked about Fenimore Cooper, who's the lesser writer, but nonetheless, Fenimore Cooper from The Last of the Mohicans, he was sort of trying to do the same thing. Not as, he wasn't as great a writer, but it's sort of this idea of making a national epic, but trying to make it real at the same time. That's very hard. That's because you're in the modern period, and history is key to the nation, but so is the myth of the nation. And I don't mean myth in a false sense. I'm not using it that way. I mean, in a healthy way, a mythic vision of the nation. So I make one argument, and it's in my book on the forest. I'll just give you a taste of it, which is that I'm not sure if this is how convincing this is, but this is what I saw. I happened to be reading an epic called The Lusiads, which is by Camões, Luis Vaz de Camões, who spent 3 years in Goa. And he makes a national, it was a side interest, and I was reading a biography of Vasco da Gama, who was kind of obviously a rogue. And but Camões, who, as I said, he was a few generations later. He was in Goa in the 1560s or something like that. And he was trying to make his way. He was impoverished and this and that. But he wrote this, what is today Portugal's national epic, which is a mythifying Vasco da Gama. When I had to make a pilgrimage to Lisbon. No, I'm joking. It was a secular pilgrimage to see the tomb of Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama's over here, and who's buried right here in a big monument? Camões. These are the two national figures, in some ways, for modern Portugal. Now, Portugal has ties to India. Here's where we get those ties that bind from Goa days, right? And so, the Lusiads was probably known. It influenced Milton's Paradise Lost. Not necessarily that he's making a national epic, though some have argued that with Paradise Lost, but more that he finds a way to combine sort of a mythic, secular ethos. So even Camões is not I'm sorry to go on so much, but when Vasco da Gama came, he was sent by a king, Manuel, who was very religious, right? Camões is not that. nor am I saying Milton. But it's interesting to see these ties because then Milton influences the Indian readers in India because of the British. So you see these sort of lineages. Now, what does this have to do with eco-criticism? Well, without going into detail, this 1572 Portuguese epic, which again has a great translation a few years ago by Landig White, who it mentions the Spice Islands, it mentions all of these, the Indies. It mentions a time, and this is written in 1572, right? So it mentions a time when you get a whole kind of global sensibility. But what the takeaway here, that I'm speaking, I have to speak louder. The takeaway here is that he combines, this was a model, I argue, for combining history and myth, or mythifying history, right? Which a lot of nations, if you look at their national epics, whatever it is, a novel. By the way, for example, for the Philippines, it's a novel in Spanish because of Spanish colonial rule by Jose Rizal. Nole Mi Tangere. So this idea of a Spanish novel, but again, Philippines was many languages, right? So but the reason I mention that is because a novel from the 1880s can be an epic, a national epic, if you will. So I don't mean you have to write an actual poetic epic, and I think that's what Anandamath is trying to do. So there are other examples in the late 19th century from around the world, or from Cuba. You have the Marti, the famous writer Marti, who in around 1900, is a voice for Cuba. I'm just giving you examples. That this was a time that the national spirits of different colonized places was being voiced in this way. Bunkim found the combination of I'm reading from my notes, romanticism, history, and national myth-making irresistible. He admired, quote, Western historical writings, and I'm quoting from Tapan Ray Chaudhuri, because he recognized that a memory of past glory was an essential component of a nation's greatness. A memory of past glory. Now, often that past glory is couched in natural imagery. Why should that be? Because again, this may be tradition, but it's also this idea of trying to evoke a sense of place, even if it's just pure imagination, right? He excitedly read Scott's Waverley novels, Ray Chaudhuri tells us, and other historical romances, and knew his Paradise Lost, though he complained of Milton's unconvincing characters. At the same time, he understood the self-serving nature of these subjective histories. And though his writings are justly famous for brilliantly satirizing both colonial practices and Indian babus who imitated English mannerisms, he was also a bureaucrat, right? He earned his living, after all, as a bureaucrat in this establishment, and believed that science and infrastructure were as important for a modern nation as an intimate knowledge of Indian literatures and history. So that is Tapan Ray Chaudhuri's sort of summation. So it seems likely that one reason the Portuguese poet Camões in the Lusíads chose to focus on someone like da Gama. So you said, well, why did he focus on da Gama, right? Was because he, the poet, felt a connection to the mariner as a result of their knowledge of Portuguese India. However, in Anandamath, a historical epic romance evoking patriotic emotions, Bunkim chooses not to turn necessarily to one historical individual. That's the difference. That's how he's distinctly different, right? It's not an individual he turns to. He turns to sense of place in the forest. And the forest, again, as on the one hand literal, on the other hand mythic. So, and if you, the novel, it's clear when you read that. I read the prologue, and you can, and some of you who read Bengali could tell us more. But this idea that it's very clear that you sometimes uses tropes. For example, the idea of the from Kalidasa we have again I'm relying on scholars. The idea of the creeper, the vine, is very symbolic of women and beauty, right? That comes into play here. It also comes into play in some of the 19th century poetry by Toru Dutt and others. So on the one hand, you have these tropes, romantic tropes, Indian romantic tropes. On the other hand, you also have, as I said, a sense of historicity. So these historical narrative and critical contexts are essential if we're to understand not only Bankim's influential critique of European modernity, whose textual mode made Dagama, but also why Bankim's choice of forest setting is especially suited to the righteous, potentially successful rebellion, which Shodipto Kaviraj calls its non-actualized possibility that he imagines. So the idea of imaginative possibility is powerful for all would-be nations. They cannot express, right, that the revolution hasn't happened, and you're being censored. You know what they did to Jose Rizal? And I saw this in Manila, the place where he was hanged for writing a novel in 1896, 2 years before, ironically, the Spanish were defeated by the Americans. So he was hanged, but now he's a hero to the Filipinos. So if you step too far, you're going to be silenced. But luckily, Rizal had already written these books, which are still read sometimes now in Filipino Tagalog translation, and English. As Bankim's use of counterfacts indicates, so counterfacts meaning it's an imaginative way of talking about an actual historical event, but having poetic license with the facts, right? To say, for example, we have a genre that I'm not well versed with. My son reads some of these, which is speculative historical fiction. So there's one which was, what if the British were defeated in 1858? You know, what would have happened? The hinges of history. So those possibilities in a colonial context are powerful. They can inspire people. He also, I have more here where he also is responding to people like a guy named W.W. Hunter's Annals of Rural Bengal, which is still cited sometimes, but it was authoritative in some ways, but it was still very European. So he's kind of responding to that. But let me just come to some of these key points. I'm sorry, we have what time till what time? Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. We see a prime example of how Bengal's forests function in Anandamat when the thousands of Santans gather, quote, in a great recess of the immense forest. I think most of you know the premise of the novel, which is that there's a famine caused by the British, which was true, and there's a kind of holy rebellion of sort of these ascetic men who retreat to the ashram of the forest. They also invoke Mother India. That's the famous aspect of this. And they then actually attack these British troops, right? Pretty daring given the context, but that's why he had to set it 100 years earlier. So they're in the forest. This is a forest, and the monk is named Satyananda, and so forth. This is a forest enlivened by the mango and the jackfruit, by palmyras, tamarinds, and peepals, by the wood apple, banyan, silk cotton, and other trees. That's a quote from the novel, so very much making consciously evoking the actual forest trees. The naming of trees is a significant. Lipner, the translator, rightly observes that the santans, as you know, these sannyasi type holy men, enter the forest, quote, as individual householders or men of the world, and are transmuted into a higher order of celibates, unquote. So then you have a lot of problematic issues of, which has been talked about a lot, celibate men in the service of a maternal figure. So we can see how a feminist reading might unpack that, deconstruct that. He talks about what Lipner says is interesting here. He can make these. He talks about the liminal aspect of the forest. So the forest being an in-between space. There's also something which Lipner discusses, I won't go into, not for time, which is the forest as womb, as a kind of incubator of where people can then get in touch with the authenticity of India and so forth. But it's also a liminal space which a threshold space that rejects the structure of everyday urban or societal existence, right? This is enabled, says Lipner, because of the amorphous setting of the forest. So on the one hand, he names all these trees, but he never names a specific forest, which hasn't stopped scholars from trying to pinpoint it. And he wants to give it a kind of, again, a mystique, a kind of spiritual, a mystical aspect. While it is true that Bunkim frequently paints the forest in this manner, the specific trees he lists in the scene described here can hardly be termed nebulous. They can hardly be so if they are to fill the Santans with the fighting spirit needed to face British cannons. So the naming of trees particularizes this forested homeland in certain ways, conveying to his readers a situational authenticity that a very too general description would lose. So here we are a long way from even Toru Dutt, who had written not too long before, but certainly from Derozio, where it's not just sort of a Europeanized forest or totally amorphous, but it is more particularized and yet still has this mystique. The trees here supply the indexical resonance that iconicity, though vital in other contexts, cannot. By iconicity, I just mean an iconic using a tree as an iconic symbol in certain ways, like the casuarina tree. Bunkim drives home this point by instructing the reader to, and here's what he says in the novel. Picture the scene. This is the narrator. The clamorous voices of 10,000 men, the rustle of the foliage swept by a gentle breeze, the soft lapping of the waves against the riverbank, moon, stars, and a white cloud mass in an indigo sky, the verdant forest on the dark earth, the clear river and the white bank, and clusters of flowers in bloom. And every now and then, that cry dear to all, Bande, and he uses the B, right, spelling, Lipner does, Bande Mataram. To illustrate one way of reading Anandamat in the context of colonialism through an eco-critical lens, we can compare the novel's arboreal setting with those mentioned in Camões. And I show that a little bit in my book. So we could compare that if we had time, right? Side by side and see some of that, but not entirely. So he takes it further. I'm going to turn now to my laptop to just make a couple of more notes. And I think, let me just check real quickly. I believe that we are going up through Oh, we still have the home in the world. So environmental degradation is an important backdrop for Anandamat. So here's a even more specific eco-critical aspect, a fact that to my knowledge scholars have not discussed very much. An East India Company edict of 1799 compelled peasants in Bengal and Bihar, quote, to cultivate a specified amount and plot of land and to deliver its entire production unadulterated at the fixed government price to the agent. The company's thirst for new taxable agricultural lands, among which poppy cultivation was a prime revenue maker, meant the removal of more and more forests and the displacement of their inhabitants. Not just forests, but certainly among other landscapes. The nomadic lifestyles of foresters and herders, which had prevailed in large parts of the country, began to come to an end. One scholar has observed that, quote, India as it is commonly conceived, meaning in modern histories, a land of settled arable farming, of caste Hindus, and of specialist agricultural produce was very much a creation of the early 19th century period. To enforce these changes, the East India Company enlarged and exploited the pre-existing system of landowners, zamindari system, in tandem with pacification raids against tribal groups like the Bhils, who were then, in the words of one contemporary administrator, allotted wastelands and told to farm them. Poorer farmers, seeking to escape the company's punishing taxes, moved up into the hills, I'm quoting from a scholar, or onto poorer soils and cleared forest as they went, contributing to the overall denudation of many regions. The future Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, who was in India, right, the guy who beat Napoleon, who participated in this forced coercion while campaigning in southern India, when, as the 19th century dawned, he drove roads, quote unquote, drove roads through the forests of Malabar and cleared trees to a mile on the other side. Sorry. In addition to opium, cotton and indigo, in addition to opium, cotton and indigo also featured as favorite revenue-generating crops for the company to plant in deforested lands. The resulting immiseration of Indian peasant farmers was exacerbated when European planters, seeing their crops' profitability, began to take over large tracts of land in the early 1800s, as they did with indigo fields, an injustice that was deeply felt, as we know, by Chatterjee or Chattopadhyay and his fellow professional colleagues. One friend, Dinabandhu Mitra, anonymously penned the famous 1860 play Nil Darpan, did I pronounce that right? Mirror of Indigo, which attacked English planters and championed the Indian peasant farmer. This social and political context illustrates the extent to which British colonialism's profound environmental changes, and there are many studies on this now by historians, Ramchandra Guha, of course, but also many historians on environmental changes wrought by the British, that had their effects and stirred the emotions of the British Bengal intelligentsia. Not surprisingly, Chattopadhyay, who had lauded Nil Darpan, dedicated Anandamat to its author. Right? This land laments a character in Michael Madhusudan Dutt's 1861 translation of the play, was as the kingdom of Rama before indigo was established, but the ignorant fool has become a beggar and famine has come upon the land. And so, again, this idea of the context, which I enjoy looking at, for why a writer would choose such a setting, what they may have had in mind, and from an eco-critical lens and a post-colonial lens, provides, maybe perhaps enriches our understanding of the novel and why he would be so animated, right, about this. And this is these are some of the examples. So clearly there, and they had to, again, be very careful how they express this. Anandamat is perhaps most famous today for its lyrics to Vande Mataram, which later set to music. In my view, the later removal of the song from the arboreal setting of the novel, and this is my modest contribution, I'm not an expert on Bengali literature, makes it harder to appreciate its classical literary associations. In Bankim's lyrics, the mother, the embodiment of Bengal, and by extension India, is rich in waters, rich in fruit, and cooled by southern airs. The Bengali original, according to Julius Lipner's gloss, more specifically speaks of southern India's western Ghats. I would add that Bankim does not simply use Dakshina, right, meaning south, but rather Malaya, associated with the Ghats, because in ancient Puranas and epics the name refers to the same mountain range. It also connotes the fragrance of sandalwood, which grows in those hills. So that's interesting, right? So it's appealing to the southern aspect. Now, the argument is that if you take, and Lipner gives a lot of context for the lyrics, but taking it out of the context of the novel is partly problematic. We also know that it's problematic religiously, right, because of denigration of Muslims. And that if you go to the original context. So we mustn't shy away from that. And the same way in which we talked about the erasure by Thoreau and Emerson of indigenous peoples, right? We have to also look by what is omitted in the public in writing, not just by what is present. And I think if you think of Ranjit Guha's, the subaltern studies historian, talking about the prose of counterinsurgency many years ago, that great essay where he uses literary criticism, right? A lot of historians are to read between the lines, right? Because what is the use of so many words like in the English administrator's language, madness, right? That shows a kind of anxiety about something they can't control. So in the same way, we might read between the lines. We can do that through eco-criticism. This is just modeling one way of doing that. It is not saying that we have to all read Anandamat. I hope that's not what I'm getting across. Another example is, I mentioned the creepers. So here's that example. He talks about people were so hungry that they eat the creepers from the forest. Right? Now, he really does evoke the terrible famine, right, at that time, and we know there were later famines caused by the British. But this echoes Shakuntala, in which the classical Sanskrit image of creeper vines enhances the eponymous heroine's natural beauty and purity, which are embodied by her forest home. The one character here, his words are meant to shock the newcomer. He's trying to introduce Mahendra, this guy named Bhabananda, to this life of this monastery by reminding him of the degradation of Bengal's beauty, figured as feminine. Very typical, right, of the times, not uncommon. The creeper would likely have also reminded readers of Shakuntala's own beauty and of her long-suffering but ultimately successful effort to have King Dushyanta recognize her, thereby uniting forest and court, as has been observed. So a kind of unification of the forest in Shakuntala, but then he revives it in a kind of modern setting, relatively modern. Okay. A couple more lines on Anandamat, then I want to turn to The Home in the World. I mentioned the combining of, just as Bankim combines Sanskrit and colloquial Bengali, he also combines folk belief systems with upper caste Hindu belief systems. So we have, for example, the I keep going over this. We have, for example, Durga, right? So that's more predictable, who representing Shakti and Prakriti and so on. But we also have Banu, which is the forest, whose name tells you is the forest goddess. Specifically, scholars say if you go back, comes from a particular tribal group in Bengal. So all I'm saying is that he's mixing, in the same way he mixes language, he mixes motifs. and belief systems in order to be all encompassing. Now, we said that he has that blind spot, right? He has that in this novel, I mean, which is uh, talking about Mir Jafar and sort of the Muslim denigration. But again, he's contradictory. In other places, he praises some of the Mughals and so forth. So it's a complex and I'm not well versed enough in the history in Indian history to comment on that, but I can say that he is. It seems to me pretty adept at mixing the vernacular with the upper or established idioms. Maybe we can say that, and that is something that a lot of great writers try to do. Okay. There's also, if I had time, the idea of using bhakti traditions to which were instrumental in that sense. Okay, let's turn finally to the home and the world in the last 10 minutes here. I don't think this novel needs an introduction. 1916 novel, and it's also, of course, been filmed famously by Ray. But writing in 1995, Indrani Mitra, like many scholars, sees it as, quote, useful for an understanding of this momentous political phenomenon in two ways. That is, the movement, independence movement at the time. First, the novel enacts the social anxieties connected to the production of the new Indian woman at the turn of the century. More importantly, it underlines the crucial significance attached to the discourse of sexuality in the negotiation between opposing forms of political action. So we talked about, as Partha Chatterjee has also talked about in The Nation and Its Fragments, this idea of the home and the world, right? That was a key paradigm. And so that is something that Tagore does not come to a resolution about. He lets the reader decide. And this is, again, where the backdrop is the zamindari system, right? The landowning system. For example, Nikhil represents the home in the book's title, Sandeep, the world. As Chatterjee says, he does not comment on Tagore's novel much in his book, but his thesis is that the domain of the home became a site of resistance against the world of colonial politics. But is there a connection to environmental issues? Right? And you may be wondering about that. He famously argued, Tagore did, as we know, for a renewal of ancient Indian sensitivity to the natural environment, including the forest, right? We've talked about that. And he writes eloquently in many works about the vital need for people to sustain and to being in correspondence with local forest, flora, and fauna. I mean, as I understand, I have friends who went to Shantiniketan. It's very much, that's part of that holistic learning, right? Now, this novel, appearing at a time when nationals seemed to have to choose between, among, I should say, Gandhian, militant, and other forms of anti-colonial struggle, is more interested in delineating these tensions and less directly concerned with environmental ones. Nonetheless, the critique of feudalism, the zamindari system, compels us to view India's national ideological struggles as being inescapably tied to the materiality of its landscapes. We cannot ignore that actual historical backdrop, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind. Here I have another quote from Roshinka Chowdhury. She seems to be my favorite scholar here. So she's amazing. She's writing on so many things. She reminds us that the apparent paradox that although the novel was not held by Bengali readers to be as great as his other fictional works, such as Gora, it nonetheless began to garner more scholarly attention in the early 2000s. So here's something interesting of it, pedagogically. Why is the home and the world now so taught? Well, one reason perhaps is because English departments teaching post-colonial literature seem to have gravitated to it. But another is that the novel crystallizes a trope prominent in many post-colonial novels of the home and the world, right? I think, in other words, it's not that it's artificially being taught, but it does seem to capture a paradigm that is very important to a post-colonial context. Chowdhury revisits her earlier point that Bengalis have criticized, right, the novel, and she reiterates Tagore's retort that he is neither a historian. Let's see what pages. I hope I don't. Hope I still have these pages. Oh, here we are. That he is neither a historian nor a political activist, but is a creator. And I'll close. I just have a couple minutes here. Oh, I still have 5 minutes. Chowdhury nevertheless lauds the volume as a whole for providing, or lauds. Yeah, that's right. Lauds the novel for providing. She lauds certain recent scholars for providing social and historical context for our reading of the novel, such as Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's essay, Understanding Panchu, a very minor character. Here is another way then to read between the lines, if you will, or to pick up the subaltern characters, who is the only Dalit figure in the novel, the minor character, to provide insight into caste politics, I'm quoting from his essay, in the East and North Bengal in this period. Airbrushed out of history textbooks, the aspirations of a whole swath of the population is shown to have ignited a resistance to mainstream politics that becomes more significant in this light. And then I'll pick it up down below. Indicative of a catastrophic lacuna in the process of imagining our nation, unquote. This is what this essay argues. The failure to integrate Dalits and Muslims into dominant national agendas spelt doom then at the time. Now, that's one way of criticizing the novel on a sort of socio-political basis, right? So, that takes us more into a post-colonial realm than an eco-critical, understandably. But again, I think implicit in this, just to remind us, is that you can then, as some of these younger scholars have done, accentuate the context of the feudal zamindari system. What's producing this? Remember, I mentioned Edward Said saying in his book, 1993 book, talking about how Jane Austen manners are enabled and produced by slave plantations. A lot of people didn't like that at the time. It was interesting if you go back and read the criticism. Like, you're cheapening, Jane Austen, And that's not his point. He's not saying don't read. He loves Jane Austen, right? Not as a person, but as a writer. So the idea is that in the same way, we can look at a great novel and try to, after all, we're looking at it because it's worth looking at, right? And try to provide a context for it. If you're interested, as you know, perhaps the same applies in a same debate applies to teaching Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, for example, which Achebe famously calls, or he calls Conrad a bloody racist. Rightly so, I think. But on the other hand, do we just dismiss it, right? Altogether. This is a predicament we face with many novels, right? And I don't want to shy away from that. We're not at that level with The Home and the World. Nonetheless, it is a reminder that the ethical impulse of post-colonial critique compels us to look at the blind spots in all writing, right? It has taught us to look not just in post-colonial writing, right? And it can come at a cost where you feel like your favorite author is now no longer. My daughter, she's a lawyer, but she reads a lot, and she says every time she finds out something, she loves films and all, likes Hindi films too, but every time she finds out something bad about the real life celebrity, oh man, now I can't watch that, right? So in the same, it's hard to, and I have students who say, or they'll say, I get this a lot. This is just such grim writing. It's just too tough, you know. Now, admittedly, life is tough, and sometimes you want, but I don't know that we go to college for escapism. So, so in any way, I just want to end by saying that there's also a lot of great critique of middle-class Bengali women's subjectivity at the time. For example, Chaudhary notes, if the Indian woman's selfhood in the first decade of the 20th century needs painful reconstruction from material overwhelmingly written by men, the records in the instance of British women are slightly more substantial, but not by much. Thus, Chaudhary notes as an example how in one essay, the tragic inconclusiveness of the ideas of nation and womanhood is foregrounded to show how their visions are inscribed within two kinds of masculinities, as well as different conceptions of freedom. So you could even argue from a feminist standpoint that Sandeep and Nikhil are, they're kind of arguing across the woman they love, right? Which gets close to this idea of triangular love that Sedgwick talks about, but that's another story. And I just want to end by saying that, again, this does not mean that, we can also, by the way, see different versions of Shakti represented in some of these modern women. But we can't shy away from the fact that these are this is a male kind of ethos that's still expressed. Even though at the time we now know from the great volumes like Women Writing in India, that we have women's writing that was happening but was not either published or not judged to be worth reading. Yeah. So, thank you. I'll stop there.